Hello, this is the second lecture on one of the best mystifications of all time. It began almost 100 years ago with a little lie by Yvonne Calment, but it continues now with the deception of those whose profession seems incompatible with lying. For now, we leave Jeanne and Yvonne on the terrace of the Belvedere Sanatorium to prepare to the most important events of their lives. Here, I will explain the reasons why the scientific consensus unequivocally supports this longevity record and why demographers and gerontologists continue to claim that Jeanne Calment's case is the best ever validated and to deny what they call a conspiracy theory based on tiny inconsistencies. Calment's longevity is cited in many thousands of scientific papers and numerous books to support various scientific and social arguments. Researchers acknowledge that this data point alone significantly changes parameters in their models and even provide calculations with and without Calment, but they prefer not to even mention the possibility that her age may not be authentic. How can so many scientific papers be wrong? Is the fact that Jeanne Calment lived to be 122 as well established as the fact that the Earth is round? It turns out that all these thousands of papers are based on a single source. In this lecture, I will talk about the guardian, Madame Calment's longevity record, the person who managed to convince the entire scientific community and the public never to investigate this case because it was already the best validated case ever. So let me introduce you to an eminent scientist, Jean-Marie Rabin, whose pioneering work is cited more than 1,000 times a year and who has recently co-founded a new Institute of Aging in France. Rabin took on the task of verifying the age of Madame Calment in 1992, when she was a 117-year-old woman from Arles and he was a 41-year-old demographer from nearby Montpellier. At the time, his work was not as popular as it is today, but since 1995, his citation index has soared. Was this a coincidence? In 1995, several influential scientists visited Arles to congratulate Madame Calment on her 120th birthday and to acknowledge the efforts of her validation team. Among them was the eminent demographer James Worpel, founding director of the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. Worpel had proposed the theory that mortality ceases to increase in old age, and by validating Calment, Rabin provided an exciting experimental confirmation of this theory. Worpel and Rabin decided to prepare for a huge upcoming wave of supercentenarians and inaugurated the much-cited International Database on Longevity, IDL. In the 90s, many scientists expressed serious doubts about the validity of Jeanne Calment's record, and there was even talk of a possible identity switch with her daughter Yvonne, but her validators managed to defend their work. They published a paper entitled The Oldest Human in the prestigious journal Science, and the validation was accepted by the scientific consensus. Speaking about the identity switch hypothesis in his book on aging, Tom Kirkwood declares that we should banish such thoughts from our minds. Jeanne Calment's word and the extensive documentary detective work by Rabin and Allard are the best we can rely on. Since then, Rabin has never looked back. Whenever he is asked about Calment, he always finds many arguments in favor of her authenticity, and it seems that no one questions what he says. In this talk, I will examine these arguments. Let's start with his most recent interviews.
Eh bien, nous avons en France un grand spécialiste de la question.
Il s'appelle Jean-Marie Robin, il est directeur de recherche à l'INSERM.
Donc notre généalogiste qui a fouillé les archives d'Arles, les archives du département, a recherché des informations qu'a priori seule Jeanne Calment pouvait connaître. Alors je vais vous donner un exemple de ce type d'information. On savait dans quelle école était Jeanne Calment, on savait à quelle année, dans quelle classe, etc.
Rabin claims that the validators knew where Jeanne went to school. In his own validation paper, published on the Max Planck Institute website, he gives the address of Jeanne's primary school as Place de la République. Obviously, they hadn't found any information about the Benet pensionat, otherwise they would have known that it was located on the corner of Rue de la Calade and Rue du Cloître.
La pension Benet, vous dites qui était sur la place de la République, La pension religieuse, où est-ce qu'elle était exactement? Quand vous étiez petite, que vous alliez à cette pension religieuse.
Elle était d'entrée dans la cour de l'archevêché.
Ah,
Il y avait un grand escalier,
oui.
là il y avait les classes.
Bon.
Oui.
Mais la bibliothèque municipale est dans l'ancien palais de l'archevêché. Et c'était là votre pension.
Oui.
Autrement dit, cette pension, elle était un peu annexée à Saint-Trophime, là.
Oui.
Madame Calment told them that it was in the old Archbishop Palace on the Place de la République. It would be strange for Jeanne to forget the location of her school, which she attended for many years. Yvonne, on the other hand, was less likely to remember the details of Binet Pensionat, as it had closed before she was born. When her doctor repeatedly asked where it was, she would probably give the location of her own primary school. The location given by Madame Calment for Jeanne's secondary school was again incorrect.
Vous y êtes resté jusqu'à quand à la pension Bénet?
Ah, ma communion.
Et après, vous êtes allé où?
Ah, au collège.
Il s'appelait comment ce collège?
Ah, non, pas plus. Collège. Je suis collège.
Où est-ce qu'il se trouvait ce collège?
Mais où il y a déjà, le musée. C'est ça. On en a fait au musée.
C'est dans la rue de la République. Le collège, il était sur les lys ou dans la rue de la République?
Non, je me rappelle plus.
Est-ce que c'est là où on a fait le muséum art latin?
Oui, je crois. Je ne suivrai pas, je crois. Oui, c'est là.
Vous étiez pensionnaire à ce collège?
Ah, non.
Madame Calment apparently forgot that Jeanne attended the Cours secondaire de jeunes filles and confused its name and location with the college attended by Yvonne's father, Fernand Calment. At the beginning of 2019, Rabin was busy defending his validation. He was asked by journalists to explain why the identity switch was impossible.
Récupérer le nom des professeurs qui avaient enseigné dans ces écoles les années où Jeanne Calment était là. Donc on connaissait le nom des profs de physique, de géographie, de mathématiques et autres. Elle nous a donné les bons noms. Est-ce que vous connaissez, vous, une fille qui connaît le nom des professeurs qu'avait sa mère à l'école?
Fortunately, 15 hours of interviews with Madame Calment were released by INSERM in 2022. And we can now check what he says.
Est-ce que vous vous souvenez du nom de vos professeurs?
Comment?
Est-ce que vous vous souvenez du nom de vos professeurs?
Non.
Ou, et
Non, ça plus facilement.
vous oubliez facilement.
La farandole.
Almost all the interviews were conducted by Dr. Leber, but the very first one was started by Rabin himself. Rabin did not give up. He tried to find out more about her childhood.
Est-ce que vous vous souvenez des copines qui marchaient avec vous?
Non, c'est vieux ça.
C'est vieux?
Pour me rappeler, leurs physionomies sont difficiles.
Est-ce que vous vous souvenez de vos copines de solfège?
Les prénoms, non.
Et le nom de famille non plus? Non plus.
In later interviews, she managed to correctly name one teacher, Dubourget, who was famous for breaking things and whom Yvonne might have known from conversations with her parents.
Et quand vous étiez au collège, le professeur de mathématiques s'appelait Dubourget.
Oui.
C'est bien ça?
Oui.
On l'a retrouvé dans des journaux de l'époque.
Ah oui, il était maladroit. Et c'est professeur de physique. Il faisait des expériences, il cassait tout. Il était maladroit. J'avais une histoire avec lui.
We found the names of the teachers at Jeanne's secondary school that she would be expected to remember, including the headmaster and the painting teacher Dieudonné, who, according to the newspapers, was known to all the pupils, but she never mentioned any of them. She also remembered the name of Gachon, a piano teacher in Arles until 1916, who Yvonne would also have known. She says that Gachon taught her from the age of 7, and that was more recent than her teachers in school.
De ceux qui vous enseignaient la musique chez vous, chez vos parents?
Ah, oui, c'est plus récent, ça.
Oui,
Oui, j'ai la famille Gachon,
famille Gachot?
Mademoiselle Gachon,
Oui.
ça c'est mon professeur de piano, pas au début, pas au début.
Rabin wondered if Madame Calment might have a better recollection of the time after her schooling.
À 16 ans, après mon brevet, je suis resté chez les parents à attendre le mariage. Pendant ce temps, je retournais la musique, les dessins, la peinture, je faisais la peinture. Mais vous êtes très doué pour les arts.
Comment s'appelait votre professeur de peinture?
Attendez. Attendez. Férigoule.
Ah bon?
Férigoule. Monsieur Férigoule. Il était professeur à l'école de peinture de l'école d'Arles, de l'école de garçons.
It seemed like a wonderful discovery. She finally managed to remember the name of her teacher. Claude André Férigoule was a sculptor born in Avignon in 1863. He moved to Arles in 1897 to replace Dieudonné and worked there until his death in 1946. Madame Calment said that Férigoule was her art teacher while she was waiting to marry, but this was before he came to Arles. In the Validator's book, this inconsistency has been concealed by dividing the quoted extract into 3 different sections, a few pages apart. First, she talks about studying music before marriage. 2 pages later, she says that she did more art as a young wife. Then, after another 2 pages, she names Férigoule as her art teacher. In later lectures, I will show how similar misinterpretation of her testimony in the Validator's books helped the counter-investigators to defend the authenticity of Madame Calment in 2019, before the tapes were published. Later in the same interview, Madame Calment finally managed to remember a name from her childhood. It was her mate, Marthe Fusson, who had accompanied her to school.
Quand vous alliez à l'école primaire, là, que vous étiez petite,
Oui.
vous y alliez toute seule ou vous étiez
Oh,
accompagnée?
jamais seul. Mon père n'aurait jamais allé si seul.
Et qui c'est qui vous accompagnait?
Ou mon père ou la bonne.
Et la bonne, elle s'appelait comment, celle-là?
Marthe.
Marthe?
Oui, Marthe Fusson.
C'était votre bonne à ce moment-là?
Oui, cuisinière.
Marthe Fusson turned out to be 10 years younger than Jeanne, and the census records show that she worked for Jeanne when her daughter Yvonne was a child. This recollection therefore applies to Yvonne and not to her mother. Nevertheless, the servant appears in the original validation paper as if it were proof of Jeanne's authenticity. In 2018, audio recordings were not yet published, and all I had was the incorrect transcription marked Touchon in the Validator's book. I contacted Rabin with a question about Marthe Fusson, but he refused to discuss it. In 2019, Rabin told journalists that the validators have once mentioned the name of the servant to Madame Calment. "You never told us about Marthe Fusson." Immediately, she jumped out of her chair. "Who gave you that name?" It was spectacular because she rarely asked questions. Rabin used the story again in 2023 on Radio France to give an example of her prodigious memory for names that only Jeanne Calment could have known.
Donc, on glissait dans une conversation le nom d'une personne que seule elle pouvait connaître. Et à ce moment-là, ce qui était étonnant, c'était de voir sa réaction. Elle changeait du tout au tout. Elle devenait quelqu'un sur ses gardes qui disait mais qui vous a donné ce nom? Comment vous connaissez ce nom?
Et elle avait toute sa tête, Jeanne Calment, à 120 ans.
The tapes show that this was not the only problem with the maids in her testimony. Madame Calment told her doctor that during her childhood, there were 2 maids who did all the housework.
Quand vous étiez chez vos parents, est-ce qu'il y avait des domestiques?
Ah oui, il y avait des femmes de ménage. Ah oui, il y avait une cuisinière. Et des femmes de ménage.
Again, this was true for Yvonne and not for Jeanne. Mart Fusson reappeared in the revalidation paper of 2019, co-authored by the original validators. It is true that she mentioned Mart Fusson and that Fusson was a servant when Jeanne was married, but the validators failed to make it clear that she mentioned Fusson only in the impossible context of being taken to school by her as a child. Madame Calment never said that Fusson was her maid after her marriage. That only comes from the census. So the validators are playing with words, trying to turn a strong piece of evidence for the identity switch into something that sounds like evidence against it. The revalidation concluded with a call for retraction of my paper and the declaration of no conflict of interest.
Nous avons officiellement demandé la rétractation de l'article de Rejuvenation Research.
The press around the world received a release from the validators announcing the revalidation paper a week before publication, and multiple articles stated that an international group of researchers has once again concluded that Jeanne Calment did indeed live to be 122. The French court closed the case and the debate was declared to be over.
La farandole.
Rabin managed to convince the journalists that the attack on Calment's longevity was not justified at all.
Dans tous ces arguments, il n'y a rien de sérieux et dans un certain nombre des arguments qui ont été avancés, il y a visiblement une manipulation des données qu'il avait à sa disposition. C'est
une interprétation erronée, quoi.
C'est oui, voilà.
But they were still curious about the reasons why it was carried out in 2019.
Dans cet article, très clairement, on accuse les Russes et puis on accuse la revue qui a publié leur travail de négligence.
And he delivered the explanation. It turned out that we were working for some rich bankers who wanted access to Calment's DNA to discover the secret of longevity.
On aurait pu, on a de quoi, on aurait pu les accuser de fraude scientifique. Sauf que la fraude scientifique, c'est un crime aux États-Unis. Et là, on est dans le contexte d'une revue américaine. Et on change complètement de dimension. Donc, vous me permettrez, je vais vous répondre, hein, mais je ne vous dirai pas tout ce que je sais. Parce qu'un certain nombre de choses que je sais aujourd'hui nous amènent automatiquement du côté, c'est plus de la négligence, c'est carrément de la fraude. Et je ne vais pas comme ça publiquement accuser de fraude scientifique un certain nombre de collègues ou pas collègues. Parce que c'est plus compliqué. Effectivement, vous avez raison, on ne comprend pas. Moi, ce que je pense, et ça je peux le dire, ces deux Russes sont strictement inconnus. Donc, qui sont ces gens-là ? Qui ils ont travaillé, et mon sentiment, c'est qu'effectivement, ce sont des seconds couteaux qui ont été manipulés, par qui on ne sait pas trop. Le Washington Post a prétendu que c'était Poutine, moi j'y crois pas du tout, mais je pense qu'actuellement, ce qu'on a à faire, c'est que ces gens qui ont été manipulés ont du mal à admettre cette manipulation et ils s'entêtent en fait. Ils s'entêtent, maintenant ils s'entêtent dans leur truc à dire que Jeanne Calment n'est pas Jeanne Calment et ils en font un peu trop. Moi, je pense que la manipulation vient de ces grands sites Internet, qui sont tous des sites américains, en faveur de l'extension de la longévité humaine. Et ces sites ont énormément d'argent, en particulier parce qu'ils sont largement fondés par deux des GAFA. qui se sont dû se dire, après tout, je peux mettre quelques milliards là-dedans, s'ils sont capables de me rendre immortel ou de cryogéniser ou je ne sais pas quoi.
Rabin could barely hold back his indignation when a journalist from The Guardian suggested a DNA test to settle the debate about Madame Calment's identity. What are we going to do? Just hand it over to the Russians? To an international committee? To do what? These people are caught up in magical thinking that the secret of longevity is in her genes. In his earlier publication in Science, Rabin declared that the extraordinary longevity of Jeanne Calment was due to her exceptional genetic inheritance. He later told The New Yorker that these rich backers will never get access to the DNA. The naivety of these people. You go to the best jeweler in the world and demand that he gives you his biggest diamond? In 2021, Rabin has published a new paper on Jeanne Calment in which he seems to change his view and accept the arguments of the Washington Post, which suggests that our activity was part of a Russian disinformation campaign following the disruption of the 2016 US presidential election.
La farandole.
Calment continues to be quoted as the undisputed oldest human of all time. In the latest interview, Rabin told CNBC the reasons why she lived so long. As usual, almost everything he said was wrong. Among other things, he claims that she had a great social life, which directly contradicts his own book where she says that she didn't like the mundane social life and preferred to live in the country and hunt with her husband. Rabin provided another reason for her long life. She was also able to travel a lot with her husband and to go to Paris to see the Eiffel Tower, which was under construction at the time. Madame Calment repeatedly told her validators that the Tour Eiffel had only been built to the first floor when she visited it with her husband.
Il y avait donc un restaurant au premier étage.
C'est le premier étage, il y avait un restaurant.
Et la Tour Eiffel n'était pas finie?
Non, non.
But Dr. Leber knew that the tower was at this stage of construction in 1888 and was completed in 1889, 7 years before Jeanne's marriage. So her testimony cannot be correct.
Madame Calment raconte son voyage de noces et elle déclare avoir mangé au premier étage de la Tour Eiffel qui n'était pas fini. Quand elle est allée à Paris, la Tour Eiffel était terminée puisqu'elle s'est mariée en 1896.
It should be noted that although Rabin is certainly the most furious and successful defender of the record, he has a huge army of supporters. For example, another biography of Jeanne Calment was published in 2013 by the French journalist Jean-Claude Lamy. Curiously, the only illustration in this biography appears to be a photo of Yvonne, which Lamy misattributed to Jeanne. Lamy dismissed the identity switch hypothesis as a joke coming from a country that Jeanne Calment hated to death. He said that only Jeanne Calment could have such a precise recollection of her meeting with Van Gogh. It is strange that Madame Calment, who had no memory of any of her childhood friends and almost no memory of her teachers,
Non. J'oublie facilement.
Vous oubliez facilement.
could remember a single meeting with an unknown stranger from the time when Jeanne was 14 years old. She repeatedly claimed that Fernand Calment introduced her to the artist as his wife. Why would Jeanne create a story that could not be accurate because of her age, whether it was based on a real event or not? Yvonne grew up 2 decades later. It seems more likely that she got the dates wrong and assumed that Jeanne was married at the time of her supposed encounter with Van Gogh. This is only a small part of the huge amount of evidence. In the following lecture, I will show that her published interviews make it clear that Madame Calment was Yvonne and not Jeanne. Why did her examiners prefer to close their eyes and ears? Because it is easy to deceive those who want to be deceived. Why does Jean-Marie Rabin continue to spread information that is now so easy to refute? Because it is easy to deceive those who don't check the narrative of the renowned expert and are too lazy to do their own research. Scientists are supposed to seek the truth, but being ordinary people, they often prefer to sacrifice it in favor of their reputation, their career, and their citation index. Their colleagues usually prefer to turn a blind eye out of professional solidarity and the desire to avoid scandal. The only way to counteract such behavior is through publicity. The self-correcting nature of science is important. What hope is there for the cause of humanity if we can no longer establish the truth even in science? Don't worry, in future lectures we will return to Lisanne and try to find out what happened to Jeanne and Yvonne in the early 30s. Those who want to know the whole story are invited to read our trilogy. Scientists should be aware that if they don't seek the truth, they risk being exposed. Please show this video to your fellow demographer and gerontologist to help the truth break through the wall of lies.